In the last episode, we followed Julie Williams and Lollie Winans into the backcountry. Two women who went to Shenandoah searching for quiet and found something unimaginable. Their deaths left a wound in the park and a question no one could answer. Who would do something like this? A year later, almost to the month, another woman was making her way through those same mountains. A cyclist, strong, experienced, and alone on Skyline Drive. What happened next would send rangers running and set off alarm bells inside the FBI. Because when they caught the man responsible for her attack, they realized he wasn't a stranger to Shenandoah. He'd been there before. This is Sequestered, Season 3, The Shenandoah Park Murders, Episode 3, The Skyline Drive Attack. It had been just over a year since Julie Williams and Lollie Winans were found murdered in Shenandoah National Park. For rangers and for the FBI, the case still hung like a shadow over the Blue Ridge, unsolved, unhealed. On July 9th, 1997, another woman was moving through those same mountains. Her name was Yvonne Malbasha. She was an endurance athlete. Strong, focused, a lifelong competitor. In 97, she was 40 years old, a mother and a wife from Nepean, Ontario. 3 years prior, in a 1994 profile for the Ottawa Citizen, reporter Leonard Stern described Yvonne as both secretive and self-mocking, the kind of competitor who could laugh at the absurdity of what she put her body through. In October of 94, Yvonne competed in the double Ironman in Huntsville, Alabama, an 8.5-kilometer swim, a 380-kilometer bike ride, and an 84-kilometer run, and she won the women's division, finishing in just over 35 hours. When a reporter asked her if she ever stopped to rest, she grinned and said,
I slept for about half an hour at the 200-kilometer mark of the bike ride, and in between the two marathons, I stopped and showered for 20 minutes.
Then she laughed, realizing how impossible it must have sounded, and simply ended with,
I've always been an endurance athlete.
Yvonne didn't start competing until her 30s, but she quickly found her rhythm in the long miles, the kind that demands stubbornness more than speed. Just 5 months earlier that year, in May, Yvonne joined the Pacific Atlantic Cycling Tour, which is a 23-day, 3,100-mile ride from San Diego, California, to Charleston, South Carolina. She averaged nearly 125 miles a day through the heat of the American South, and was the only Canadian woman to complete the entire course. When she wasn't racing, she trained. On weekdays, she was up at dawn for 3 hours before work. On weekends, she would cycle from Ottawa to Montreal and back, 12 hours each way. Her husband Wayne supported her obsession. Her son thought it was cool. She told the Ottawa Citizen,
He says it's neat to have a mother who does all of this.
That was Yvonne, strong, funny, unstoppable. And that July in 97, she was doing what she loved most, pushing herself further, alone in the quiet beauty of Shenandoah National Park. On the afternoon of July 9th, she was pedaling along Skyline Drive, climbing one of its long, winding hills, surrounded by nothing but the steady hum of her bike and the summer mountain air. She adjusted her grip on the handlebars, steadied her breath, felt the heat shimmering off the road and the humidity clinging to her skin. Her focus was broken by a sound. Low, distant, growing closer. At first, it was nothing unusual. But the truck didn't pass. Instead, it crept closer. The driver leaned out of the window, shouting sexual obscenities. Then, without warning, he swerved toward her. He reached for her, tried to grab her off the bike, but she broke free. Then he turned his truck around and drove it right at her. He made multiple passes, each time trying to knock her off her bike. And each time, she was able to dodge him. Somehow, she escaped, bruised, terrified, but alive. Within hours, a ranger's radio call went out describing the red Ford pickup.
Possibly an early to mid-90s model.
By late afternoon, park rangers had spotted a truck matching the description. It was still inside the park, near the Thornton Gap entrance. When they pulled up, the driver was still standing beside it, calm, cooperative. His name was Darrell David Rice. He was 29 years old and from Columbia, Maryland. He didn't resist. He didn't even ask why when rangers placed him under arrest. And before nightfall, he was charged in federal court with attempted kidnapping and assault. Serious charges that carried real weight because the attack had happened on federal land. In the official reports, investigators described the attack as methodical. Rice followed Yvonne for miles, circling back again and again, taunting her and using his truck like a weapon. In '98, Darrell David Rice would plead guilty to attempted abduction, admitting that he tried to grab Yvonne Malbasha as she rode that day along Skyline Drive. He told investigators he'd been, quote, angry at women that day, and that he, quote, just wanted to scare her. The U.S. Attorney's Office handled the case out of the Western District of Virginia, calling it a deliberate, targeted attack. Court filings described how Rice shouted slurs and threats as he tried to force Yvonne off the road. Behavior, prosecutors said, reflected, quote, a pattern of hostility toward women. People who lived near Rice in Columbia, Maryland, described him as moody, volatile, and prone to outbursts. One former coworker told the Washington Post he, quote, seemed to enjoy intimidating women, end quote, and often made crude or violent jokes about them at work. According to federal court documents, witnesses reported that he bragged about harassing female cyclists and motorists, saying he, quote, hated gays and women because they were weaker, end quote. Neighbors recalled how he could seem polite in passing, but would, quote, snap over small things. One woman said he looked at women like they were targets. Investigators noted a clear, escalating pattern. Rice was a man driven by anger and control, whose aggression toward women was more than impulse. It was an identity. During sentencing, the judge called his actions, quote, vicious and unprovoked. And because the attack took place inside a national park, Rice was sentenced under federal jurisdiction. By the following year, he was serving an 11-year sentence at the Federal Correction Institution in Petersburg, Virginia, a medium security facility southeast of Richmond. For the FBI, Rice's arrest set off alarm bells in Julie and Lollie's case. Because this attack, it hadn't happened somewhere far from their murders. It happened on Skyline Drive, that same narrow, scenic stretch of road that cuts through the spine of Shenandoah. That same ridgeline that looks down the creek where Julie and Lollie had made their camp. It was too close, too similar. And when agents started digging into Darrell David Rice's past, what they uncovered was darker than anyone expected. After his arrest for the attack on Yvonne Malbasha, investigators began piecing together who Darrell David Rice really was. Turns out he wasn't a drifter. And he wasn't just passing through Shenandoah by chance. Rice lived alone in an apartment in Columbia, Maryland, which is a suburb between Baltimore and D.C., and just 2 hours from the park. By day, he worked quietly as a computer programmer at MCI System House, a telecommunications and IT services firm that was headquartered in Maryland at the time. But behind closed doors, that quiet turned volatile. Former coworkers described Rice as short-tempered, cruel, and unpredictable. A man who lashed out at women, mocked them, and bragged about it afterward. When investigators started digging, they discovered more than just traffic tickets or workplace complaints. They found a pattern. A quote from the indictment filings read,
"He said he hates gays and liked to intimidate and assault women because, quote, they're more vulnerable than men."
By now, the FBI had been chasing leads in Julie and Lollie's case for more than a year. More than 15,000 tips had come in. Names, sightings, theories, and then, finally, a clue that made everything stop. Park records. They showed that on Saturday, May 25th, 1996, the same day Julie and Lollie were last seen alive, Darrell David Rice drove into Shenandoah through the front Royal Gate. The next day, he drove out through Rockfish Gap, which is the southern end of Skyline Drive. And then he came back. It's a simple detail, but it's chilling. He had been in the park. He had the opportunity. And his attack on Yvonne Malbasha mirrored everything about the violence that ended Julie and Lollie's lives. Targeting women, controlling them, and using the landscape's isolation as a weapon. By early 2002, investigators believed they had their man. After 6 years, thousands of leads, and an investigation that stretched from Virginia to the FBI's behavioral unit in Quantico, the Department of Justice was ready to act. On April 10, 2002, Attorney General John Ashcroft and U.S. Attorney John Brownlee stepped to the podium inside the Department of Justice Conference Center in Washington, D.C. Ashcroft spoke, saying,
"On June 1st, 1996, the bodies of Julianne Marie Williams and Laura Winans were discovered in the mountains of Virginia in Shenandoah National Park, bound and gagged with their throats cut. Today, I'm announcing the indictment returned in the Western District of Virginia against Darrell David Rice for these brutal killings."
6 years after the murders, Rice was formally charged with 4 counts of capital murder, 2 alleging that he intentionally selected his victims because of their gender and sexual orientation.
This indictment specifically invokes a federal sentencing enhancement enacted to ensure justice for victims of hate crimes. If convicted, Rice could face the death penalty.
It was the first time the Justice Department had used federal hate crime authority to prosecute a homicide on national park land. For Ashcroft, though, this wasn't just about one case. It was a broader message.
Just as the United States will pursue and punish terrorists who attack America out of hatred for what we believe, we will pursue and punish those who attack law-abiding Americans out of hatred for who they are.
The next morning, headlines ran nationwide.
Indictments announced in Shenandoah killings.
A man who hated homosexuals and women killed 2 young lesbians in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park in 1996. The Justice Department announced the indictment of Darrell David Rice for murder and hate crime charges.
The article detailed what investigators believed had happened. Julie Williams and Lollie Winans were found bound and gagged in their backcountry campsite near Skyline Drive, their throats slit. A scene the FBI called, quote, methodical and brutal. Prosecutors said Rice had entered Shenandoah on the same weekend the women were last seen alive, and that his movements matched vehicle logs from the park. Court filings describe Rice as a man who, quote, hated gays and women, often bragging about wanting to hurt them. The FBI alleged that he had stalked the couple's campsite, attacked them as they slept, and left them bound and silenced before fleeing the park. According to their records, Rice showed no remorse of these accusations, even telling agents that Julie and Lollie, quote, deserved to die because they were lesbians, end quote. In the court filings, federal prosecutors painted a clear picture. Rice was a man whose violence towards women wasn't random. but a part of a long-term plan, quote, to assault, intimidate, injure, and kill women, end quote. They also pointed back to the 1997 attack of Yvonne Malbasha on Skyline Drive, framing it as a direct example of Rice's ongoing intent to target women. The indictment carried enormous symbolic weight. It was one of the first times the Justice Department invoked federal hate crime sentencing enhancements in a homicide case on public land. A test of how far those 1994 laws could reach.
Criminal acts of hate run counter to what is best in America, our belief in equality and freedom. The volatile, poisonous mixture of hatred and violence will not go unchallenged in the American system of justice.
For the victims' families, it was public and painfully personal. Ashcroft read their statements aloud to reporters, describing Julie as, quote, warm, caring, intelligent, and funny, someone who loved people and the outdoors. That same day, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, or NGLTF, issued a statement of cautious relief.
We're very pleased the indictment has come down after 5 years. We finally have justice for Julianne and Lollie.
At least that's what it felt like. But behind the headlines, prosecutors already knew the case wasn't as airtight as it seemed. The forensic evidence from '96 was thin. The crime scene had degraded over 8 days in the woods, and despite Rice's violent history, there was no physical evidence linking him directly to Julie and Lollie's murders. Following the indictment, Rice was arraigned in federal court. The Times Recorder reported,
Rice, 34, calmly waved to his mother and sister in the courtroom gallery before being led away by U.S. Marshals.
The case against Darrell David Rice was officially underway. But even as prosecutors prepared for trial, a new shadow was forming. A man whose crimes were so organized, so methodical, that some investigators began to wonder whether the wrong suspect might already be behind bars. His name was Richard Mark Evenitz.
Authorities in Florida say the man who shot himself as police closed in has now been linked to multiple Virginia killings. His name, Richard Mark Evenitz.
When Evenitz died by suicide in 2002, investigators found rope, duct tape, and evidence tying him to the abductions and murders of 3 young girls in Virginia, Sophia Silva and sisters Kristen and Katie Lisk. His crimes spanned 1996 and 1997, the same years Julie and Lollie disappeared. Inside the FBI's Richmond division, his name crossed a familiar file, Shenandoah National Park. It didn't take long for Rice's defense team to zero in on that detail, arguing that Evenitz's organized, sexualized violence matched the Shenandoah murders far more closely than Rice's impulsive rage ever could. Author and journalist Catherine Miles, who studied the case for her book Trailed, later connected the dots across a grim pattern. She noted that between 1996 and 1997, 8 women were murdered or went missing in and around the Shenandoah Valley. 2 of them were Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. Miles wrote that the investigators were beginning to see parallels, something in the evidence that suggested another name might belong in their files. But Richard Mark Evenitz was already dead. And without definitive DNA, that lead, like so many before it, went cold. Still, the possibility hung in the air. If Evenitz was operating in Virginia that spring, how many stories like Julie and Lollie's were still hidden in those woods? When the headlines faded, it seemed like justice was finally within reach. But inside the evidence files, cracks were forming. And the story everyone thought they knew was about to change. Next time on Sequestered, the case against Darrell David Rice begins to fall apart, and a single DNA test will change everything. Sequestered is created by Sarah Reed and Andrea Clyde, hosted and produced by Sarah, written and researched together. Theme music by Night Owl, and original music by Andrew Golden. You can hear his full song, Shenandoah, through the link in our show notes.